So let's begin our Iowa City Council work session concerning the budget for fiscal year 2019. First, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. You're responding, many of you are responding to an innovation that Kingsley Botchway came up with, the idea of having a breakfast with the budget. So kudos to Kingsley, great idea. I think we're all really pleased with it. There you go.
I like Hancock.
Likewise, kudos to the staff for laying out the donuts, the bagels, the coffee, the juice, and all that. Thank you, Kelly. I think you probably organized all that. So we're all, I don't know, pumped and ready to go. We only have a 7-hour meeting or whatever it is today. Won't turn out to be that long probably, but we're going to begin with Jeff, correct? I think the idea is Jeff's going to give us an overview of our budget for the forthcoming year.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to have some help with the presentation. Ashley and Simon are both going to take a chunk of it so you don't have to listen to me talk for an hour and a half. But I'm going to start off, and I want to start off with some thank yous. Pulling together a budget for an organization of our size is no small task. It takes several months, and it really starts with our individual departments and particularly the department heads that coordinate their budgets. And this year, they made our job a lot easier by submitting very responsible budgets. And I can tell you, there's probably not a department in the city that wouldn't love to have a lot more financial resources to carry out the services that they do to the public. But the department heads understand the financial constraints, and they submit budgets, again, that are very responsible, which makes the job of the budget committee much easier. The Budget Committee is just an internal group that sits down with each department and reviews their submittals line by line. It takes a couple of months to get through that process. Ashley, Simon, and I are on that committee, as is Dennis Bockenstedt, our Finance Director, Jacqueline Budding, who's sitting over here, Nicole Davies from the Finance Department as well. We complete that process, and ultimately the Finance Department creates the 680-page budget that you have in front of you, which I'm sure you all read over the last couple of weeks. It is no small undertaking. Particular thanks goes to the finance staff with Dennis, Jacqueline, and also Cindy Ambrose, who really do the heavy lifting to pull that together. And then to Simon for the work that he does. The presentation that you'll see and the transmittal letter that you read in the budget are really the work of Simon, so we appreciate everybody's effort there. Today we're going to be talking about the operating budget. Okay, so on Tuesday we'll talk about the capital improvements budget. Capital improvements would be the major road projects, major parks and facilities. Today we're really focused on the operations. And what we'll do today is you'll get a high-level budget overview from the city manager's office. And then one by one you'll have an opportunity to interact with department heads as they tell you what's in their budget, and again, you'll have the ability to ask them questions about not only things that are taking place in their budget, but just operations in general. Any questions that you want to ask them. When it comes to the budget, it probably is the most important decision that the council makes. If there's not resources in the budget behind a particular initiative or project, the project's not going to happen. So really, you should feel free to ask any questions that you want, because anything that's on your mind probably has a tie to the budget in some way, shape, or form. So whether that's today or at a future work session, please keep in mind that the time is now to ask some of those questions. Here's the schedule that you have in front of you. The March 15th date is required by state law, so that's the end date that we have, and there is a public hearing that has to take place before then. So really the key dates that I want to have you focus on are January 9th and February 20th. Okay, January 9th is next Tuesday. That's when we review the capital plan with you in that afternoon. February 20th is when we have to set that public hearing to meet the state deadlines. You really have between January 9th and February 20th to complete your budget deliberations and make the changes that you need to. You can actually back that February date up a little bit because obviously we have to prepare the documents for the setting of the public hearing. So really January 9th to February 10th or 12th or something in there. And that's when we'll have to work with you to schedule special work sessions as needed so that you can deliberate any aspect of the budget you need to. You do have a 680-page budget in front of you. It's not realistic that you're going to be able to digest all of that information. You should read any component of that budget that certainly you can and that you find interesting. However, in order to kind of guide you, I would suggest that these sections here are the pages that you really need to focus on. There's about 50 pages there. If you cannot get to anything else, I would focus in on these particular sections. I think they're most relevant to the policy-making decisions that you have with the budget, and the most informative in terms of some of our policies and our financial position right now. We're going to do a basic overview of our fund structure. This is how the budget is organized. What you see in each of these little boxes you can think of as individual accounts, and each of these accounts have unique aspects to them. There's certain strings attached to each one, certain limitations on what money can be spent on, and there's different revenue mixes in each of these. So I won't go through all of them, but I'll hit some of the major ones. You start on the top left of the screen with your general fund. We spend the vast majority of our time focusing on the general fund. That is where most of the operating services occur in the general fund. Your police, your fire, your parks and rec, your administrative staff all take place in the general fund, largely supported by property taxes, and we'll get into that a little bit later. That is where the real prioritization takes place. That's where you have the most discretion, but it's also where we have a lot of the financial limitations because of our dependence on property tax and our inability to add a whole lot of different revenue mixes or revenue sources to that particular fund. The next category over is our special revenue funds. These are individual funds that have very specific purposes and very specific revenue sources that support them. So you can start with the top as examples, CDBG and Home. Those are two federal grant programs. Those funds are, what we get is what we get from Congress. Each year they decide what we get, and the CDBG and the Home program have very defined uses on how we can use those funds. Road use tax would be another good example. That's the money that we get from the state from the fuel tax that people pay when they fill up their vehicles. We have very specific limitations on how we can spend road use tax dollars. I can't take road use tax dollars and build a park or hire a staff person in the fire department. So those you can think of individual accounts that just have very narrow focus. Debt service fund is self-explanatory. When we borrow money, we have a debt service obligation. So that's really our tax. We're bringing in tax dollars to pay off those bonds. Enterprise funds are treated like a business account. You can think of it as the government running a business without the profit motive in there. So each of these funds are designed to be self-sustaining, meaning that the revenue that they bring in pay for the expenses that are going out. Probably the easiest way to focus on that is to look at some of the utilities, like a water account. What we charge on the water bill is what we need to run the water system. When we raise a water rate, we're not raising water rates to build new roads or to build new parks. We're raising water rates to pay for the water system itself. So each of these accounts that you see there are really designed to be self-sustaining. They each have revenue that directly relate to that particular service. Capital projects funds, again, that's what we're discussing on Tuesday. That's the big projects. A lot of what the public's usually interested in is when is this road going to be improved? When is this park going to be built? That type of thing. And the internal service funds, we don't spend a lot of time on with the budget deliberations. That's really just the inner workings of the city. How do we pay for our computers, our phones, our fleet? This is our insurance programs, things of that nature that don't really reflect public services, but support the internal operations of the city.
Jeff, before you move on, I'd like to ask a question that maybe would be of benefit for people in the public. It has to do with the enterprise funds. So am I correct in understanding that the enterprise funds, the fact that we have enterprise funds, is really a policy decision? There's no legal mandate that we have specific enterprise funds if we wanted to. I'm not trying to push this. I don't want to do this, actually, but we could blend that all in with the general fund in some fashion?
Yeah, I would say you can use general fund dollars to support the enterprise funds. So if you take transit, for example, if you wanted to enhance transit service, one of the options that you could do is look to raise money in the general fund and move it over to transit to support that. It typically wouldn't work the other way, where you're not going to use water rates to fund something in the general fund.
Well, yeah, I guess I need to be more clear. The fact that we have a wastewater enterprise fund is a policy decision. That's what all I'm trying to get at. I don't want to change it.
Sure.
I'm just saying that's a fact. So in the past, somewhere deep in the past, there wasn't such a thing.
Correct.
And then there was.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Theoretically, you could have no wastewater fee to your residents, and you could pay that through the general fund. It'd be very rare, but
yeah,
yes, you're correct in that.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to just take a step back from the budget and kind of set the stage and make sure we understand the context in which we are operating right now. And really, we're in an era of robust growth in this community. And if you look from 2010 to 2016, we've grown by 6,500 residents. Those are census numbers. That is a very robust pace of growth, and I'll give you a bit of perspective so you can understand the magnitude of this growth. Here's, using those same years and same census data, here's some of the growth of the neighboring communities in eastern Iowa. And inevitably, every year when the Census Bureau comes out with their population statistics, you will get a rash of stories on the fastest growing communities in Iowa. Iowa City never makes that list of the fastest growing communities in Iowa. You frequently will hear about North Liberties and the Tiffins and the Waukees, which are experiencing phenomenal growth. But one thing I want to make sure that you understand is we're adding more people than those communities are adding. And when you hear the stories about the growth in North Liberty and Coralville, it's often attached to the challenges with that growth, whether you're talking about housing, whether you're talking about infrastructure, public safety services. The challenges that they have are real, but so are the challenges that we have when we're adding 6,500 people in 6 years. So a bit more perspective that I'll share with you is that, in the last 2 decades, if you look at the 2000s, we only added 5,600. In the 1990s, we added 2,400. We're on pace to add over 10,000, maybe 11,000 residents in the decade that we're in right now, 4 more years, again, to add to the 6,500. We will probably add more population this decade than we've added in any other decade in Iowa City's history except the 1960s. I don't think we'll probably get there. We could, but in the 1960s we added 13,407 residents. So robust growth that we are experiencing, and there's a lot of challenges that come with that. And that affects, certainly the policy side of things. It also affects, on the staff side, the operational and the service delivery side of things. The service demand challenges I just mentioned, I want to just give you a sense of where the city as an organization is. So I'm not talking about the external community. I'm talking about your 600 plus employees right now. during this period of robust growth, we've had exceptional change in the city organization. So typically when a community is growing as rapidly as we are, you would find that we're also adding employment to bolster those services. 6,500 residents need fire protection, they need police protection, they need new parks. But actually during this time, we've reduced our workforce by 5%, which is about 30 positions. And we've done so out of necessity financially. We've also turned over 60% of all our management and our confidential employees. If you look at the department head positions, we've nearly turned over 100%. Not quite there, but we're pretty darn close. And there's a list up there: clerk, city manager, neighborhood and development services, public works, parks and recreation, transportation services, finance, police, fire. Some of the people holding those department head positions have been with the city a long time. They were internal promotions, but some are external too. Regardless, there's challenges that come when you turn over that high a percentage of your management staff. You lose a lot of institutional knowledge, and that is a challenge for us. Some departments are completely turned over. If you look at all their management staff, one of our biggest ones is Public Works. Not only has the department head changed, but each of the operating divisions, the leadership in those divisions has changed, sometimes twice in our streets division. So there's a lot of challenges that come with that, and I think our staff has responded extremely well. But this is the equation I talked to our supervisors about when I met with them a couple months ago. This is what I'm telling you. We have a rapidly growing community. We have some shrinking operational resources, and we have high management turnover. That makes for a really difficult equation, and that's the backdrop at which we're going to be having our discussions today. So let's jump into the budget goals. We have 3 budget goals that we want to convey to you as we put this together. One is responding to property tax reform changes while maintaining service levels to meet the growing population and the increasingly diverse population that we have. So it's not only that our population is growing, but the makeup of our community is different, and our services need to evolve to reflect the changing demands in our community. So a few of the things we've done to address these budget goals, and this isn't just a one-year effort. This has been a goal of ours since 2013 when the state passed the property tax reform. We've really focused on building our reserves. Our reserves are our savings account. In each of those boxes I talked about earlier, we've really focused on making sure that we have healthy savings accounts so that we can address sudden drops in revenue. For instance, as we'll talk about, if the state takes away the backfill. We want to make sure that we are prepared to address that. With this particular budget, we are able to add, and we're recommending that we add some positions in our housing inspections and our police department to bolster some of the core services, and we think do so in a way that reflects the council's strategic plan. We're also making a concerted effort to invest in technology to increase the ability of the current staff to do their job more efficiently. And there's some examples up there. We're going to get into a conversation about expanding a downtown camera network, for example, in the police department. That is not only, you shouldn't think of that as not only a public safety measure, but one that frees up a lot of time in our police department. And we spend hundreds and hundreds of hours of investigatory work on downtown crimes that take place that a camera system could relieve. So when we think about how do we grow our police department to meet the growing population, this is one way. It's not always adding staff, it's also utilizing technology, and I understand that's a very important policy discussion that you all will need to have, but that's what we're looking at. And one of the things I want to make sure you understand is when we look to the technology, often the times the technology is a one-time investment as opposed to an annual ongoing, or if there is an annual ongoing component, it's a much lower cost than the initial capital outlay. We're in a position right now where I feel much more comfortable making that one-time commitment financially. Because there is some uncertainty with property tax reform going forward. I have hesitation in adding staff, because when I hire a staff person, I want to make sure that I can be confident that we're going to have the resources to support that staff person in 5 years, in 10 years. I don't want to ever hire somebody and in 3 years say, I'm sorry, we don't have the financial resources to support you. And that's what the property tax reform does. It puts a big cloud of uncertainty over our ability to continue operations at the current level. When we can invest in technology, again, that's a one-time outlay that can really help our staff, but it doesn't have that same cloud of uncertainty going forward. The second budget goal, which I know is very important to you, is to make sure that the funds that we are spending reflect your strategic plan and reflect the master plans that we've recently adopted that are rooted in great community input. And we talk a lot about the bicycle master plan and the parks plan. Obviously, the community contributed greatly to those plans. They were widely accepted by the city council. We want to make sure that this budget is going to accomplish what those plans laid out. And I'd say the same for the plans that are in progress right now, including the climate action plan. So I won't go through the list there. This is a high level. We will go through in more detail throughout the day how the budget is addressing your plan, but these are some high level topic areas that we feel our budget that we're recommending to you addresses. It'll be your decision to tell us if there's sufficient funding behind each of these things, but we can certainly point to areas in the budget where we're addressing each of those bullet points. Our third goal is to maintain an affordable tax and fee environment for our residents and businesses. This probably will always be a goal when we compile a budget, but we're very proud, and I hope you are too, that we're looking at a 7th straight year of a property tax rate reduction. We're going to spend some time talking to you about that today. We're not recommending any new taxes with this particular budget. We are recommending one fee increase, which is the 5% increase in the water rate, and that's really to reflect the system maintenance needs that we're projecting out over the next 5 or 6 years. So when we get into the capital plan and you start to look at the water investments, how many water mains we're replacing and where we are making improvements to our system, we need funding to support those. And it's a 5% increase is what we're looking at there. And we're not looking at increases in any of other utilities at this time. So what is the cause for concern? I talked about the uncertainty going forward. And I apologize in advance. You're going to be sick and tired of me talking about property tax reform by the end of the day. But it absolutely affects everything that we do and we plan for going forward. And I'm going to start now. So the commercial backfill, and this is a check that the state writes us every year. So when property tax reform was implemented, commercial properties received a tax break, and the state said, don't worry, cities, you're going to be left whole. We're going to write you a check every year. If you've been following the news, and I've shared a lot of articles with you, that commercial backfill continues to be in jeopardy, and it looks increasingly likely that it will either be taken away or phased out. And so we're going to have to adapt to that. Multi-residential taxability, these are the apartments. You know that as part of the reform, multi-residential properties receive significant tax break that's still being phased in and will be phased in for another 5 or more years. That's just something we're going to deal with. Every year, our tax base erodes as they get more savings from their tax bill. We have a declining residential rollback, and so this is your single family, how single family properties are taxed, and we're going to get into that. And then these are some things that are volatile expense items. This is always going to be the case with city budgets. We have expense items that are hard to predict from year to year. Fuel prices. We've benefited from low fuel prices from a budget standpoint for several years, but it didn't, wasn't, what, 4 or 5 years ago when fuel was almost twice what it is now. In an operation like ours, and you think about all the cars and vehicles that we have on the streets, that can really shoot a hole in your budget. Healthcare is another one. We're going to talk a lot about growth in the city. We've obviously experienced a tremendous amount of growth, and that's really helped us through these first 4 years of the first few years of the property tax reform. It's not likely that we're going to sustain that growth, and so I want to talk about where I think we're going to end up and the challenges that that's going to present. And I think we're seeing, particularly in this past year, a whole lot of uncertainty in some key industries in town. And this is more of an indirect impact on the city. But you look at the healthcare industry right now, and we're certainly, with UIHC and Mercy, very dependent on the healthcare industry in our community. And there's some tough financial times that they're experiencing now, plus a whole lot of uncertainty in the healthcare field. If those major institutions, Mercy and UIHC, are not expanding, investing, bringing in new people, if they're cutting back their workforce, that has a ripple effect through our entire economy. That affects housing starts. That affects the success of local businesses. So that's a challenge. And certainly the university itself, which is our major economic engine, we know the discussions that have been taking place over the last few years at the state level and how the state is funding the university, or how the state is more appropriately not funding the university. So what changes might they go under? Are they going to be looking at cuts and reductions in workforce? And we have to understand that's not a direct impact on our budget, but it affects how we project growth in our community and reinvestment in our community. So this is the property tax reform slide that some of you have seen for several years now. I don't want you to worry so much about the narrative at the top. I want to focus on the graphic on the lower right-hand side of the screen. And it's a little difficult to read, but what you have across the bottom is your years. So it starts over at fiscal year 1980 and goes all the way to fiscal year 2024, which is when the property tax reform is fully phased in. And you have three different color, actually 4 different color lines there. You have the blue line, which has the greatest volatility. That's the you can think of as your single-family homes. And this is showing what percentage of each of these categories, which percentage of their value is taxed. And then you have the green and the red. Green is industrial, red is commercial. You'll see that those lines were even at 100% for many years. And the fourth line doesn't come into play until the very right-hand side of the graph. That is the multi-residential. Multi-residential never existed prior to property tax reform. Multi-residential, if you owned an apartment building, it was considered to be a commercial property, right? That makes sense. It's probably your job. That's what you do for a living if you owned an apartment building. The state legislature said, no, I don't think that's really a commercial enterprise anymore. I think it should be more of a residential type of tax structure, and that's why you see that purple line eventually meet the blue line. The goal of the state was to say that the apartment should be taxed the same way a single-family home is. So what you see here is that for a long, long period of time, at the very top of that graph with the green and the red, that commercial properties and industrial properties were taxed at 100% of their value. So if you owned a commercial property that was worth $1 million, you paid taxes on $1 million of value. Well, the state said, we want to bring that down as a way to help businesses and encourage reinvestment from businesses. We want to bring that down to 90%. So you can see how it drops down and then it flattens out again. It's going to stay at 90%. Well, that gap, that short little diagonal line, that represents the backfill. That's that check that the state writes us every year, and that's about $1.5 million. I've got a slide after this that'll break that down. So that's where the state told us, you're okay, cities, we're gonna keep funding you. The purple line is that multi-residential line, and you can see on the table to the left that every year it goes down about another 3.5–4%, and the budget that we're talking about right now is 78.75%. So if you 5 years ago owned $1 million apartment building, you paid taxes on $1 million worth of value. In this coming budget year, you're only going to pay taxes on 78% of that $1 million, so on your $780,000. So you can see that every year that goes down. Every year, that's our tax base eroding. We have to make up for that somehow. Especially
since we've had a great deal of investment in multifamily structures over the past few years and have more coming online.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is when I talk about my reluctance to add a whole lot of operating, long-term operating commitments. It's because I know that our tax base is going to continue to be chipped away, and I don't know if we're going to have the same resources to support that. I feel comfortable at this point saying the status quo operations we can continue to fund through this property tax reform. I do feel comfortable in that. I think the steps that were taken when I started this and I said we had to reduce our workforce 5%, I think those steps were really, really important, and they put us in a position to kind of keep the status quo going forward. Unfortunately, we're not a status quo community. We're a growing community. But I have some hesitation to add, particularly because of this multi-residential piece.
But just for the multi-residential piece, you said they are not doing any backfill, right?
Correct, yes.
And the goal, the state goal is by 2024 to be just like a residential?
Yes, that's correct. So the blue and the purple become essentially one line. The blue line is your single-family homes. That's always been very volatile. There's a complicated state formula that we use to determine the taxability of single-family residential properties. And you can see it's been as high as 80%. It's been as low as roughly 44%, I think. And we have a slide that'll blow this up. But you know, simply put, the lower that number it is, the better it is from a homeowner standpoint. You're paying lower amounts of taxes, but from a budgetary standpoint in the city, we're not getting those same number of resources. So over the last few years, you've seen that slowly go up for us. Well, that's another reason we've been able to get through the first few years of property tax reform, because our residents, our single-family residents, are paying more and more taxes. That's offset some of those losses. This is the first year in which we're actually starting to come back down, and that presents a budgetary challenge to us.
Jeff, how this reduction in the multifamily percentage, is that typical for other states? How does that compare with other states?
Yeah, it's really hard to compare the tax structure from state to state. It's very different. I don't have a good answer for you, John, on that. I would say I would find it very uncommon to think, I would be surprised, I should say, if apartments were treated like residential property in other states. They might be, but I'd be surprised. I think intuitively most people think that that's a commercial enterprise. So I'm going to break down each of these components for you and just give you some perspective on what that means. So this is the backfill. This is that 10% that I've talked about a couple of times. For us, it means 1.5 million, and it's not just 1.5 million that we can use anywhere we want. It affects all our different levies. So when we set our tax rate, it's actually made of many different levies, and we'll get into those. But you can see how it impacts each of our different levies. So general fund takes the biggest hit. And that's almost $800,000 of loss that we would see. Transit would take a big hit, and even the Schmid district, the Iowa City Downtown District, because they have a tax levy that you guys have authorized, they would take a hit on the backfill being removed. So what's $1.5 million mean to us? Well, if you wanted to pass that along through a property tax reduction, you'd knock off 44 cents on your tax rate. it would mean roughly 15 police officers or firefighters. And then you can see it also would be the combination of all our pools, the animal shelter and the forestry division combined. So it's a huge, huge chunk of money for us. You know, to give you an example of you know, on the fire side, we need a minimum of 12 firefighters to open up a station. So we lose $1.5 million. That's the equivalent of wiping off a fire station. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen if the state takes away the backfill. I don't want that to get out there, but I'm just trying to give you some perspective on what $1.5 million means. Again, what I really want to convey with this budget is, with the backfill going away, I feel comfortable because of the preparations that have been made that we can maintain status quo. But I can't look at the fire chief and say, you know what, we're going to be able to add another fire station in the next few years, because obviously we're losing a lot of financial resources. That's the backfill. Let's go to multi-residential. Multi-residential has been incrementally impacting us every year. If you remember that table, it's about 4% a year that impacts us. For fiscal year 19, when the apartments are taxed at 78.75% of their assessed valuation, that means if you applied our tax rate to the difference between the 78% and the 100% that they used to be at, that's another $1.6 million. So now the multi-residential with this budget has become more costly than the commercial backfill, and that number is going to continue to grow year after year after year. To give you some perspective on what $1.6 million means to us, it's pretty similar to the last slide, but it's also what we spent on road resurfacing this year. Our entire road resurfacing budget was $1.6 million this year. That's what we lose. We could double our road efforts without those dollars.
Jeff, sorry if you can't understand me. Can you clarify that $1.6 million is the tax revenue that we have lost on the apartments since property tax reform started?
That's an annual number.
That's an annual number.
That's an annual number.
Thank you.
It's about, I think the first year was roughly 900,000 or so. The second year was about 1.2, 1.3, and this year's going to be 1.6. So you can think of it growing probably several $100,000 per year. So next year when I show you this slide, I'd probably guess it's going to be around 2 million. This is the residential rollback here. Again, this is the single-family taxability, and you'll see from really 2006 roughly up until the current year, it had steadily increased. This is the first year that we've actually seen a drop. So we dropped 1.3 points, or the equivalent of 2.3%. Just another challenge for us as we look to maintain our operations. Okay, my last slide before I turn the presentation over to Simon. How have we navigated this so far? We're a few years in here. How has the city been able to do this? Well, largely because of the great, robust growth that we've had. So the chart that you see across the top is the building permit construction value from 2008 to 2017. So you have a 10-year history here. So when someone applies for a building permit, they have to tell us what the value is of whatever they're building, the home, the remodeling project, the commercial building. And you can see I broke it out into kind of 4-year segments here. From 2008 to 2011, our community was seeing on average $100 million in new construction. We started to experience a large uptick in the 2012 to 2015 era, where that jumped all the way up to 161. Really phenomenal jump there. You think about a 60% growth over those 4 years. And then 2016 and 17 happened, particularly 2016, where we blew everything out of the water in terms of any records that we would have. We had $388 million in value added to our community. We just closed the book on 2017, and we finished just over 200, which again is a phenomenal year looking at this trend. But I can tell you, I don't believe that we'll be over 200 next year. And just knowing what's coming, and you have to understand there's a huge lag in these values. For example, in December of 2017, what put us over the edge was a $44 million permit that was pulled on the Chauncey project. Okay, so usually, particularly with the larger projects, you're doing incremental building permits. You're going to get a foundation permit, then you're going to get kind of a structural steel permit. And so these things take some lag. And just knowing what we have coming in, I think we're going to come back down to normal levels that we should expect going forward. Which is still going to be strong growth. I think we've got some really good projects coming forward. We're just not going to, match the Hilton Garden Inn, the Rise, the Chauncey. Those were things coming together at one time that it's probably pretty rare that we'd see that coming again. There's a lot of narrative on the bottom. I'm not going to provide that to you. I think the biggest thing I want to stress is this fifth bullet point, the last one there. When I talk about maintaining status quo operations, you have to think about 3 to 4% growth per year. If you just think of salaries and benefits, we're looking at 3 to 4% per year just to maintain status quo. And so when you talk about losing the state backfill, that's 10% of commercial value that we lose. We talked about the multifamily of 4% a year. And then we talk about the residential rollback that's starting to decline. All of a sudden, we're in a pretty big hole to start. We gotta grow out of those holes. We got to make up for that backfill. We got to make up for the multi-residential. We got to make up for the residential, and then we've got to find another 3 to 4% on top of that to maintain status quo. If we want to add, you got to get on top of that more. So, as this growth comes down, there will be a significant challenge just to maintain status quo. I think we'll get there, but to think about expanding services, we're going to be really hard-pressed to do so. I'm very happy that we can recommend to you a couple of new police positions and some housing inspections positions, and I hope over the next few years you're going to see strategically added positions, 1 here, 2 here, but there's not going to be a time in which I'm coming forward in the next few years that say, hey, we can add 6 or 7 positions in a given year. I just don't think we'll get there. So that's the backdrop at which we're at. The rest of the presentation, Simon's going to walk you through some of the particulars on the revenue. Ashley's going to walk you through particulars on the expenditure side, and then I'll kind of provide a wrap-up before we get into the department presentations.
Hey, Jeff. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Jeff, before you move forward, you talked about going back down to levels of like kind of average growth. Are you talking about that 161 average level?
Yeah, I think that's probably realistic for next year. I would think, it's a shot. It's kind of a shot in the dark, but I think we'll be at that 150 to 170, 175. We've got some decent-sized projects coming forward that would push us there. But again, it's not just the big projects. Last year we had 150 new single-family homes built, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's quite a bit. And if you multiply out what the value of those are, that adds quite a bit too. And that's why I talked about earlier, when key industries in our community are facing uncertainty, if they're not hiring, if they're not replacing positions, we're not going to see those same single-family starts. We're not going to see new apartment buildings built because there's that uncertainty in those key positions. So that's going to contribute to, I think, a declining growth. But make no mistake, if we're above 100 million, I think we're doing pretty good.
Jeff, I wanted to ask about the recent enactment at the congressional level of federal tax cuts. And I'm quite aware that many states around the country and some cities, I don't know how many, have been trying to conjure up creative alternatives in response to uncertainties generated by that congressional set of congressional tax cuts. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what we know is going to filter down our way with regard to those tax cuts, and then whether you've seen anything in terms of innovative ideas about.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of conversation about that, but I don't have any conclusions that I could share with you at this time. I think there is a lot of uncertainty. I think it's more so at the state level. as you look at the questions of federal deductibility and those types of things, and how the state's going to respond to that. But I'd be happy to try to pull together some information from council on that. There's a lot of conversations with cities right now, but I'm not sure there's a clear picture going forward. But I'll follow up with you on that.
All right. Moving deeper into revenues, Jeff discussed a lot of the factors that affect our revenue mix. So now we'll move into what that revenue mix actually is.
Simon, just to be clear, you're Simon Andrew,
Oh,
right?
I'm sorry. Yes, I should start with that. I'm Simon Andrew, assistant to the city manager. Appreciate everybody coming today. This is by far the biggest turnout we've had for a budget work session since I've been here, and I think it's fantastic that the public came out for it. So the first slide here is all funds revenue. So this covers all of the boxes on the previous slide that Jeff showed you with all of the different accounts, all the different funds we have. So this is all of those funds other than the internal service funds. As you can see, very heavily reliant on property taxes. And again, Jeff noted the need to have an increase of 4 to 5% a year just to maintain status quo services. And so you see in those property taxes, we're a little above that. And we'll get into the reasons for that in a little bit here. Overall, across all of our funds, we're down about 3% compared to last year, and this largely has to do with both a decrease in intergovernmental revenue, largely due to bus purchases, a federal grant that came in the 2018 revised budget, and some differences in bonding versus using general fund dollars for some capital projects, and that is in the other financial sources line. So probably a little more digestible way to look at that, those numbers, is this pie chart here. Again, you see across all of our funds, we are heavily reliant on property taxes. The next biggest slice of that pie is charges for services. So those are your water bills, your sewer bills, parking permit fees, recreational programs. Next biggest piece of our revenue mix is intergovernmental revenue. As I noted, this includes the federal intergovernmental revenue is the biggest piece of that, as well as the road use tax funds and local 2080 agreements for services. Then we get into much smaller, drops off significantly after that. You get into animal adoption fees, debt sales, hotel motel taxes, et cetera. So again, as Jeff noted, we focus mostly on the general fund at this point in our budget deliberations. It's where you all have the most discretion, and it's where we fund our core services that the public really identifies as our core services: police, fire, parks, and recreation. Very heavily reliant on property taxes, and this is largely due to constraints at the state level. The state really dictates to us what we can use as a revenue source and how those are structured. The next biggest slide, the next biggest slice in that, again, is intergovernmental revenue. So our overall property tax receipts over the last decade are on this slide. Again, you can see that we've had a little over a 4.5% increase as compared to last year. But if you look back over the several previous years, if you keep in mind that we need 3 to 4% to maintain status quo services, you'll see several years in there where it was below 3 to 4% or even a negative number. And that is when we were starting our response to property tax reform. That's when we started reducing our workforce almost exclusively through attrition that Jeff noted, getting that total employee count down about 5% and doing some other things, debt restructuring, to prepare for property tax reform. So you see in those 2013 to 2015 years is when we really focused on controlling costs. In 2019, part of that increase above the 3 to 4% is additional resources devoted to strategic plan initiatives that council wants to see, and more transfers to capital project funds to catch up on some deferred maintenance. Property tax rate trend, as Jeff noted as well, this is our 7th consecutive recommended decrease in the property tax levy. But if you think of this chart in concert with the slide right before it, you'll note that even in most of those years where we were decreasing our rate, people were still paying more in dollars on their property taxes. And that's related both to valuations and that residential rollback figure. So this is the first year in those 7 years that both the residential residential rollback figure went down and our levy rate went down. So people will be paying less, assuming that their valuation stayed the same, they will be paying less in real dollars as compared to the previous year. And it's important to keep in mind the overlapping property tax rate, too. And there's another chart that we'll get to on the next slide. But, of course, residents don't pay property taxes just on our revenue. The three biggest slices of that are the city, the county, and the school district. And we should be mindful moving forward that of the property tax rates of those other institutions. So we know that both the school district and Kirkwood have significant facilities needs, and their property tax rate will likely increase in the years going forward to help fund those. And those are things that our community really wants to see, and that City Council supported, especially in the school district's bond levy. So as those levies go up, we will want to be mindful of making ours go down, or as best we can, balancing out that increase in the other levies, so residents don't see a dramatic increase in their overall property tax bill. The line across here, now the percentages on the right are a pretty narrow window, so that line's probably a little misleading, but you can see our percentage of the overall total of the property tax levy, and so we're down in the low 40s now, but as those others increase, we will want to account for that. So other major revenue sources, in most of our slides you'll see us project out a couple of years. On this one, this is just the past 4 years of actuals. We budget for these very conservatively, given the uncertainty in these revenue sources and the volatility that is included in them. Hotel motel tax, you'll see, is increasing pretty steadily over the last several years, and we expect that to increase quite a bit in the next few years. Between 2012 and 2019, 91% increase in hotel rooms in Iowa City is expected. And so that includes hotels that have recently come online, such as the Hilton Garden Inn, but we also have Hyatt Place, the Element, the Chauncey, that will have hotel rooms added to our community's inventory as well. Gas and electric excise tax, this replaces property taxes that used to be charged on utility companies. It does float with valuations in our property tax rate, but it is meant to account for what the property taxes would have been for those utility companies if it was charged on the property and not on the service delivery. And then the final one on this slide is the utility franchise tax. This is a tax that we charge on utility bills. Currently, Iowa City charges 1% on utility bills. This was originally passed to help fund Fire Station 4 on the east side of town. This floats quite a bit with the weather. So you'll see in fiscal year 2014, there was a spike there. That was a very cold winter, and so utility usage went up quite a bit that year. So again, a volatile revenue source. Council can go up to 5% on that, and you'll see on a subsequent slide later what other cities have their rates currently at. That one does not need to go to a referendum. Council can act on their own to set that anywhere between 0 and 5%.
Let me follow up on that.
Sure.
Am I correct in understanding that we could increase it to, I don't know, 1.5%, 1.6%, 1.7%?
I believe that's correct, that it doesn't have to be in whole number increments, but I'd have to follow up on that. But yeah, my understanding is anywhere between 0 and 5. Cable franchise revenue. So these revenues have been declining over the last several years. You know, you have fewer subscribers in a lot of cases. Our city franchise agreement with Mediacom expires in July 1st of this year. There was a state law change in 2007-2008 timeframe that allowed cable companies to move to a state franchise agreement under certain circumstances. So after our agreement expires in July of this year, Mediacom will have the option of moving to the state franchise, which we expect that they will. And so on top of this declining revenue that you see here, we would expect another 10% decline on top of that. There are other revenue sources in addition to the cable franchise fee that we get, which includes pass-through funding for public access television and public educational and government programming, what's called PEG programming, and you see dollar dollar amounts there, those will both completely go away on top of the dollars that you see in the chart there. The dollars that you see on the chart are what fund our cable TV operation, and help us provide those services. The pass-through funding we just send on to public access television. We have been in discussions with them since the state law changed, a number of meetings, hoping to prepare for this eventuality that we knew would be coming. So again, this revenue source is uncertain at best moving forward. All right, so those are our major revenue sources. I'm going to move into a little bit of comparative analysis. There are only a couple of slides here, but this compares us to other cities on some of these revenue sources. So you see the property tax levy rate comparison. And we have two columns here, both our high point in 2012 compared to where we are today. In 2012, we were a penny off being the second highest in the state amongst the larger communities. And as you can see, we've moved down to the middle of the pack here. We have had the largest percent decrease over that time period. And again, that's a combination of that rollback increasing, of our robust growth. As our tax base grows, we can charge each property owner a little bit less and still get the same or more revenue, as well as valuations increasing. We've seen our property values in Iowa City increase substantially over that time frame.
Simon, can I jump in and make one point here? You keep in mind that no city is equal with property tax rates. We show you a ranking, but you have to understand a lot goes into the ranking. More goes into on the revenue side, which is Simon's going to talk about. So some of these cities have different revenue sources than we do. You might have gambling revenue, you might have sales tax revenue, which we don't, which allows them to have lower rates. And in some cases, they don't offer the same level of services that we offer. So our goal is not to get down to a North Liberty or even a Coralville. We won't get down that far. We have a professional fire staff that's fully paid. We don't run a volunteer department. We have a human rights office. We have a senior center. We have more services that we offer the community, and unless we want to start peeling services back, which I don't think we do, we're never going to get down that far. So understand that this is a comparative analysis, but we're not trying to convey to you that we have to get to a certain level. It's a lot more complex than just the numbers that you see there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Utility franchise tax, as I mentioned here, several cities of our comparison group don't have the franchise fee at all. Us and Coralville are at 1%, and the other cities that have it are a little bit higher. A couple of those have increased in recent years. I believe Cedar Rapids and Dubuque both increased theirs, and that goes to gas and electric bills largely. Local option sales tax. So Iowa City, as Des Moines metro areas pursuing their local option sales tax last fall and this spring, we could potentially be the last large community in the city, or in the state rather, that does not have a local option sales tax. You can see the estimated receipts for FY18 here, and as Jeff mentioned, this is largely what informs that property tax rate slide for a lot of those other communities. For instance, Dubuque and Ames down there, 50% and 60% for property tax relief, respectively. It gets their levy rate down quite a bit. But as Jeff said, that's not something that we're communicating as a goal of ours. But this certainly does allow quite a bit of flexibility for cities. You'll see in Cedar Rapids they have an immense amount of road construction and public infrastructure work going on right now that is funded from the $18 million a year that they get from local option. We would project ours to be in the $10 million range if we were to have a local option, and that's for the city share, and that's largely dependent on what other cities or if the unincorporated county pass theirs as well. It goes into a county-wide pot that's then distributed largely by population. So,
Simon, is there any restrictions for local option sales tax funds? I mean, could we just use it for general funds dollars if we chose to do so?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's essentially what property tax relief is. It goes into the general fund, and that effectively comes off your levy rate. When you place it on the ballot, you have to define what your purposes would be, but yes, you do have a great deal of flexibility as to what those purposes would be. You could even identify, a general fund service that you wanted to use it for, and then it would, replace those property tax dollars within the general fund.
One thing I would mention, Simon, with that, you see that they have sunset dates. Now, you can pass a local option sales tax that goes on for in perpetuity that does not have a sunset. Typically, especially the first time a community passes it, they're probably not going to give you a blank check forever. They're going to say, let's try this for 5 years, and then maybe after that it becomes in perpetuity. But if you have a sunset on your local option sales tax, you are not going to want to use those for operational dollars. Okay, you're not going to want to pass a local option sales tax and open a fire station with those dollars, because if the community does not support that renewal in 5 years or 10 years, then all of a sudden you have no money to support that fire station. So typically what you'll see is, you see street repairs, you see infrastructure, parks, you see capital investments that are done with local option sales tax, even a property tax relief, because if those dollars expire, there's not a sudden loss of service to the community. You're maybe not repairing as many roads, but you're still picking up the trash, you're still doing those types of things. So if you're thinking about local option sales tax and you want to have that discussion, I would just very much urge you not to focus on operational services if you're going to push for a sunset date.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And to that point, Cedar Rapids, the first local option that they had in recent years was in the 2000 timeframe. They had a 1 year that was 100% for parks, and they made huge investments in their parks and pools in the community. After the public saw the benefit of that, then I think that they were more likely to pass it. They did have a couple of votes that failed in recent years that had very complicated allocations of the funds when they moved to 100% street repair infrastructure. That is something that generally the community can get on board with. So they sort of followed that path that Jeff was describing there. And that is my last slide. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley for expenditures.
Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Ashley Monroe. I'm the Assistant City Manager, and welcome everybody. So I'll just take a quick look at the general fund expenditures. Here's a pie chart identifying the various expenses that we have from the general fund. As you can see, we have a fairly labor-intensive organization, so personnel takes up 72% of the general fund. So as we introduced earlier, the police, parks, fire, personnel, our general offices, finance, all come out of the general fund. And we also have the next biggest piece of the pie, services are for 18%. This includes, our fire and casualty insurance, equipment rentals, professional and consultant services, some of our internal services, so IT, risk management, central services provides mail, and other services. We'll go to the next one. I'll explain a couple more. So here we have a chart showing the proposed budget and the percentage change. So personnel, as we've said, keeps up with that 3 to 4%. Just have an annual increase as a status quo kind of approach to our hiring and our staffing. We have our services, which I explained prior. You see, again, just that generally status quo increase in that amount. Supplies, we try to keep at a moderate spending level. In the last couple of years, we've tried to reduce the amounts that we're using for supplies. That just goes to general operations, materials. Capital outlay is different than our capital expenditures. So our capital investments, I guess, or improvements you'll talk about on Tuesday. We see a decrease here, and that includes things like vehicle purchases, small equipment, maybe some office furniture. So we've reduced those over this year for our proposed budget. We have the contingency. It's 1% of all expected expenditures, so just laying out a portion of what we might expect we need if expenses go beyond their budgeted amounts. We have our debt service. The explanation for that reduction, that 60% reduction in debt service from the general fund, we had quite a few university homes. Those are for that program, and they were held for a little while last year, I guess. So we've sold those properties, and the proposed amount just indicates that we're expecting less expense as far as the university program.
I need to apologize for some typos on this slide, clearly.
Oh, okay.
That total down there at the bottom.
Okay. Well, so we have several public pension systems. So I'll start with the public safety pension contributions. This is the municipal fire and police retirement system of Iowa, shown here on this chart. It's governed at the state level, so the city doesn't have any say in what the employee contributions are. So we're capped as to what or I guess we're required by state to put in a certain amount of money into the pension system. So we've had a contribution rate over the last couple of years that's fairly steady. It varies year to year. 17 contribution was 25.92, 18 25.68. 19's expected contribution rate is about 26.02. So you see it's fairly steady, but still varies. And over time, you've seen in this chart, changes in that percentage as to what we've had to contribute. So some years, as in 2014, we had to contribute significantly more. It's gone down quite a bit in those percentages, and it's kind of ramping back up at this point. So this also fluctuates as the market fluctuates. So as returns decrease, we're expected to put in more regardless of what the market returns dictate. Our next one is IPERS. This is the general employees, non-police and fire pensions, and as you see, the contributions here have also increased. This is a 60-40 split between the city and employee contributions to the pension system, and both systems, despite the volatility in what we pay, are fairly well funded at the state level. So they're in good shape despite the increase in what we have to pay each year. So we have something people have interest in as far as our personnel changes that are coming up. I have some detail here. We've talked about adding 2 new police officer positions. One of them is going to be specifically for neighborhood response and a downtown liaison. So that's one of those positions. We also have the promotion of an officer to the street crimes action team. There'll be a working sergeant. We have housing inspections, so we're adding 2 new inspector positions. The 0.1 increase to that from 6.2 to 6.3, or I'm sorry, 8.3. We moved a small portion of a building inspector from the housing authority to accurately reflect our costs. We also have landfill. This is a little tricky. There's just a slight change in that position. We moved some customer service representatives around between refuse and landfill. They split costs for customer service as well as a superintendent position. So when we reduced one of those positions, there was a little bit of a balance that bumped that up. We also have some changes in finance through finance administration, information technology, and accounting. So last year we had added a position and reclassified some, and so these changes this year are better reflective of what finance positions what finance positions are needed. So we have a new budget analyst / internal auditor. We're going to fully implement an internal auditing program in fiscal year 19. And then we're eliminating one position in IT that was due in part to that reclassification. And then the accounting position is the elimination of a portion of a part-time, or I should say 0.6% of a full-time equivalent. Okay. So I'll also talk a little bit about debt service. The state of Iowa limits us to no more than 5% of our total assessed property value to be issued. So Iowa City is projected to be at 1.09 of total valuations. So that means our total debt. Iowa City policy specifies also that debt service levy should not be more than 30% of our total city levy in any fiscal year. So we're at 19.9% of the total levy. We have debt restructuring and elimination continuing to be a critical component of our strategy, and another 1 or 2 more years of debt service levy reductions are projected. So as we've seen a decrease in the property tax levy, a good portion of the reduction in that levy comes from a reduction in the debt service levy. Debt service is just our annual principal and interest payments on our general obligation and TIF bonded debt. So in this chart here, we're just taking a look at the ratio from the amount we're allowed to borrow versus the debt that we've incurred. So our outstanding debt. So, and that ratio has shrunk significantly, so that blue amount is the amount we're allowed to borrow, and then the red is the portion that we have outstanding. So we've reduced that quite a bit, and we're staying pretty static at 21.9% of our limit. Okay. We have a bond rating is helpful, is especially helpful when you're trying to account for expenses incurred when you're borrowing money. So we work with Moody's. It's a third-party independent group that we pay to assess our financial situation, but primarily their job is to assess these communities, but they're working for the investors, so there's no stake that they have in politics or within our community at all. But we like to work with them so that we get an independent rating, an open and honest evaluation, if you will. So we prepare when we talk to Moody's. We talk to them a couple of times a year, or at least once a year. And so when we do that, we're preparing by just taking note of all of our assets, our current debt, our planned expenditures, what's going on in the community. We talk with them. We prepare financial information for them. They go back and analyze it and come back to us with the rating. So we have a AAA bond rating, which nationally is, as you see, is quite difficult to do. So not many communities, it's on the chart, 219 nationally hold that rating. And then in Iowa, we're one of 3 communities that hold a AAA bond rating. So us, West Des Moines, and Clive currently hold that status. That's it.
Okay, I'm going to take us back through the home stretch. I know we're running a little late. We always do, but I appreciate your patience here. I'm going to kind of wrap some of this up. We've got about a dozen more slides or so. The enterprise funds, again, these are the business account funds that we operate. And I think from a policy standpoint, one of the things you want to key on is our unassigned fund balance. That's the second column from the right-hand side. I want to point a few things out to you. There's been a lot of discussion on transit, and I think the council's anxious, as is staff, to really dive deep into transit and try to make some changes that will better serve the community. I want to point out that we have a $5.6 million fund balance in transit. And each year we have been running a surplus in our transit account, which means we're bringing in more revenue than we're putting back into the system. So this fund balance continues to grow. I believe for the current year, our surplus is projected to be around $500,000 or so. But we're doing so intentionally. We certainly realize that surplus could potentially be deployed to providing higher levels of service. But as some of you know, if you've been through our transit building, we have a very old transit facility that is inadequate. We don't have room for expansion out at that site. Bringing on new buses would be a challenge. We don't have the capacity to store those buses. We don't have the maintenance facility to take on new buses. It was built on an old dump site, and we spend a lot of money counteracting the effects of building on a dump site. There's a lot of settling out there. It's just a poor facility. Some of the council members toured the Public Works facility about a year ago, and the transit's out at that same location. A new transit facility is you're probably looking at about a $15 million expenditure. And so, you know, if you look back, you know, in history, typically the federal government would help you out with a transit facility, and there'd be maybe a 70-30 cost share, with the federal government picking up 70, or an 80-20 cost share. And we've always thought that, you know, we needed these $4 or $5 million to pursue a federal grant when the opportunity comes up. Unfortunately, in this day and age, federal grants of that magnitude are rare, and they're extremely hard to come by. And so it's becoming increasingly likely that we're going to have to pay for a larger portion of that ourselves, if not the whole transit building ourselves. So $5 million is not going to cut it. We need to continue to have a strategy for putting money aside for a new transit building. Frankly, it's needed now, but we're not within, you know, while we have land secured on our Public Works campus for the transit building, we're not close to being able to come to you with a plan to build a new facility. So we just have to keep that in perspective as we start to have transit discussions, and that's a policy decision. How much do you want to save each year for a new transit facility versus how much do you really want to pour back into the service itself for the residents? A couple other things I'll point out. You see some really high fund balances in operations like wastewater and water. Those are healthy balances, but you need those. As you look at the capital plan on Tuesdays of the water and the wastewater, you'll notice that a lot of the capital investments are millions of dollars. So having a $13 million wastewater fund balance is nice, but when you're talking about, you know, several projects of the $4 or $5 million range, you'll see why we have that type of fund balance. The last one I'll point out is the stormwater down at the bottom there. That's a little low. That's a little lower than I would like to see that. Ideally, that number would be over $1 million. You know, a typical stormwater improvement project that might come up, it wouldn't. It could be several $100,000. And while we don't have, you know, anything immediately pressing that we're not addressing, stormwater continues to be a major challenge, and will continue to be a major challenge going forward. So, you know, in the coming years, I think the staff's going to have to look hard at that stormwater account and really come to you with some plans on how we use those dollars, and potentially look at a rate increase to get that balance up to a more comfortable level. Just quickly compare water and sewer rates. Iowa City's kind of right smack in the middle there. If you combine water and sewer, we always compare ourselves with the 10 largest cities in Iowa, and then we throw in North Liberty and Coralville just for some comparative purposes there. You know, water and sewer rates are really so dependent on the major, you know, kind of the treatment operations. Iowa City is extremely fortunate that we have two relatively new treatment facilities in our water and our wastewater. So we don't see a whole lot of, you know, major growth in our rates going forward. I think we're going to be pretty steady. Obviously, with this budget, we're recommending a 5% water increase, but we've got really good facilities, and frankly, on the wastewater side, you know, a brand new facility that we didn't have to have the ratepayers pay for. You know, we were able to leverage flood funds to pay for that. You know, if you look at the communities on the higher side, it's likely that they are making major investments into their treatment plants, and that was the way they paid for them. If you look at the communities on the lower side, I know Coralville being one, they have some major projects coming up in which you'll probably see their rates escalate pretty quickly as they have to pay for a new treatment facility. So again, the fee changes that we're talking about, the only one is the water, 5%. We are also recommending, if you're familiar with this, we do have an option on our utility bills right now where if you sign up for SurePay, which is a direct deduction from your checking account, that you get a $1 credit on your bill. This was done many years ago to incent people to sign up for that. It's about an $80,000 roughly expense for us to do that. And we don't feel like that incentive is needed anymore. Certainly we want people to sign up for that, but $80,000 is a considerable amount of money, and we just think it's time to remove that. Not really related to the budget, but one thing we're anxious to roll out this next year pretty shortly here is a voluntary donation program on our utility accounts for our low-income assistance efforts. So you may have seen this on an electric bill or a gas bill where you can check a box and donate $1 or $5 to a low-income program. We've never done that, and we're going to give that a try and hopefully increase the amount of voluntary resources coming in to pay for discounts to those users of our utilities that are having trouble paying their bills. Currently, the city, the users, so we all pay water rates, we just use those to pay for it. So to the extent that we can get people to voluntarily donate funds for this cause, it's going to be a relief on all the utility users in the community. And the last point, while not included in this budget, in the last budget that the council approved, we did change the waste fees. And so as of January 1st, just last week, there's now a new $2 monthly charge on your utility bill for the yard waste program and the compost program. That replaces the $25 stickers or the $1.50 bags that you had to buy before. Talk about property tax impact. We use an example of a tax on a $100,000 residential valuation. $100,000 is easy to multiply, so if you have a $300,000 home, you can just multiply these numbers by 3. Fiscal year 18 is the current year. Fiscal year 19 is what we're looking at. And so you can see on a $100,000 home, for the city taxes itself, a resident is going to pay $30 in less taxes to the city. And there's a couple of things going into that. One is that rollback numbers going down. Okay, so we dropped that so that you're paying taxes on a smaller % of your valuation, and then our tax levy goes down on top of that. So that's why you see a $30 reduction. The commercial property side is quite a bit different. This reflects the impact of that property tax reform. So if you look before property tax reform was implemented in fiscal year 12, on the far left side of this chart, a $500,000 commercial property was paying just shy of $9,000 in taxes. There was a tax break or benefit extended through property tax reform where they're only paying 90% of their value, not 100% of their value. And so you can see over time, between a combination of the state reform changes and our property tax levy coming down, that same valued commercial property is now only paying $7,200 in taxes to the city. Now, what I would say to you is this is a very simplified graph for illustrative purposes, but there's probably not a commercial property in town that did not experience some valuation growth. So that property, if it was valued at $500,000 in 2012, it may be valued at $700,000 this year. So those taxes would go up as that valuation occurs. We like to show this graph because we try to represent what all the changes collectively that we're making in this budget, I'm sure that we're proposing in this budget, how they would impact a typical residential user. And so you see from fiscal year 18 to 19, the two far right columns on the side, you see there's the $30 less in property taxes. The stormwater fee stays the same. The refuse, we're accounting for that $2 charge that just took impact, so that goes up. And then the water has a 5% increase. So the typical user is experiencing a 0.6% increase in what they're paying the city through the various utilities and property taxes. I think for a lot of users, it's actually going to be 0 or less, because if you were buying yard waste bags or if you were buying the stickers on the side, that was never reflected in this chart before, where it is now. So it's really a no growth or actually a negative growth impact to our typical residential households. Okay, getting into some highlights here to wrap things up. We have, again, experienced really strong growth that has enabled us to really prepare for the property tax reform. Over the last few years, we've been able to establish nearly $5 million in an emergency reserve that provides further cushion for us should there be sudden drops in revenue or other opportunities that the council wants to pursue. Our operational reserve funds are really strong. You know, we talked about those with the enterprise fund. With the general fund, we target a 25 to 35% reserve. And we currently, with this proposed budget, we're sitting at just shy of 36, so we're a little bit actually above the high end of this particular budget. And we've been above our policy target the last several years, and what that's enabled us to do is direct some dollars to some really important community initiatives. And so I wanted to stress that to you. As we're getting surplus funds in, we've not only created the reserve fund, but we've created opportunities to fund some things that we felt were going to be out of reach for many years. Last year it was the Public Works facility, $2.5 million to enable us to finally pull the trigger on that long-needed Public Works building. This year, we're able to use, we budgeted $2.8 million as a contribution to the Behavioral Access Center. We're able to do that in cash because of the surplus that we have. That's a phenomenal position to be in, to be able to really come up with those types of one-time capital dollars for a project that is widely being called for in the community and supported in the community. So this budget does have those dollars in there. And we've also been able over the last few years to start contributing to a affordable housing fund. You know, this council created the Affordable Housing Fund, and over the last 3 years there's been nearly $2 million that have gone in there in local funds, and that does not count the $1 million that came from the RISE. So this budget has $650,000 from the general fund. So did the last budget. And then previous to that, we bonded $600,000 for the project that's being constructed in Towncrest right now. So that's roughly the $1.9 million. And then again, the funds from the sale to the RISE group is on top of that. We have increased the general fund transfer to the CIP, particularly trying to get to where I think we need to be in order to aggressively implement the bike plan and the parks plan. We hit the tax decrease, certainly a highlight for us there. And then we've been able to really strategically focus some investments in staff in a couple of key areas there. I'm not going to go through. We've got 3 slides. This is in the transmittal letter in the budget. I'm not going to go through each of these bullet points, but I wanted to give some illustrative examples to you about how this budget reflects your strategic plan, understanding that your strategic plan is going to be tweaked here in the coming months. But strong local economy. We continue to invest in the local foods. The council created that local foods line item a couple years ago. That's still in there. Community gardens has been important. This budget calls for enhancements to 3 locations. When we look at the urban core section, a couple things I'll point out there is the bike plan implementation. You're going to see a lot of bike lanes striped next year, particularly on Dodge and Governor, 2 major bike lanes. They'll be our first buffered bike lanes in the community, which I think is exciting. And we've got a small amount set aside to reestablish the building change facade program in downtown, which we've dropped for a couple years, and I think we'd like to bring that back, and we'll talk about that during the economic development section later today. Sustainability, there's a whole page dedicated to sustainability here. In addition, we have a capital fund dedicated to whatever comes out of the climate plan. We've really got some aggressive energy efficiency measures that we're going to be pursuing in our facilities. You see some lighting, some boiler replacements. We've got a couple of tree planting corridors that are reflected here on Camp Cardinal Boulevard and Lower West Branch Boulevard. One of the things I'm really excited about is we're creating a natural areas maintenance program for the first time. We've always had a lot of natural areas, Hickory Hill and Ryerson and those types of facilities, but we've never really had a dedicated program to maintain those. We've just done the best we can. Well, you authorized some funds to go through a natural areas study. That plan is currently being finalized. You will eventually get a copy of it, but it was far enough along for us to really create a program to where we say we might not be able to do everything we want to do, but we can really start to focus on properly managing our natural areas. One thing I do want to mention there on the previous slide is the landfill gas study. You've all looked at the greenhouse gas report in previous months. You know that our biggest generator of greenhouse gases is the landfill. And so if we're going to get serious about attacking greenhouse gas emissions, we really have to focus on how to better utilize the gas that's out there. And there's some funds in the landfill budget to do that, to start that process. Healthy neighborhoods, probably the biggest thing here, 2 biggest things is the contribution to the Affordable Housing Fund and the form-based code development. $385,000, that's what we're looking at for the next phase of the form-based code. So you previously had spent 150, 200, somewhere in that range on the feasibility study. You're looking at close to $400,000 to actually move us to actual code language, a significant amount of dollars to do that. We're working with the consultant to finalize that. That'll ultimately be a contract that comes before you. And then you see a number of things on the social justice side, the biggest being the Behavioral Access Center contribution that we previously talked about. Look ahead, we just spent a lot of time on 19. I always like to kind of tell you what I think you're going to expect in the coming years too, so you can keep that important, or keep that in mind as you go through your deliberations. I think we've got a couple years left of the tax rate decreases. Remember, we're decreasing our tax rate really out of our debt service levy. It's not our operation, it's not our general fund levy, it's not our transit levies or anything like that. We're reducing it out of the debt service levy. As we project out our bonding, we probably have about 2 years left, I think, of decreases, and probably some fairly significant decreases before we start to level off. So we're in the low 16s right now as a tax rate. I think we'll probably end up, at this point, my best guess would be in the mid 15s for a tax rate, which I think puts us in a very, very competitive tax rate position, and one that I think everybody would be very proud of. Utility increases, I mentioned refuse, landfill, stormwater. I'm not saying we're going to pursue in those areas, all 3 of those, but those are the areas that probably are next up at some stage. We've talked about the growth coming back down. We're going to continue to selectively add positions. You know, with last year's budget, it was the streets division where we were able to add a couple positions. Now it's police and housing inspections. There's a few others that I'd like to get to, and we hope to in future years. I'd like to have a more, and this is on the staff side, I think we really need to start thinking about long-term public facility planning. And I've listed some examples there, but as we're experiencing growth, we just need to anticipate the growth in our operations, and in a lot of cases just address woefully inadequate facilities. So I listed a few up there. I'm not saying that, you know, those things are going to happen in 3 to 5 years, but we need to start thinking 10, 15 years out and really coming up with a plan and a funding strategy so that we can tackle those when the time comes. You know, federal uncertainty goes without saying. We get a lot of federal funds, and who knows what's going to happen. I know we're really nervous about things like transit and our housing authority and our CDBG and home programs, but we're at the mercy of whatever's allocated, you know, whatever they want to do. So we'll just have to wait and see. And then, you know, I think the biggest limiting factor that we have is our staff capacity right now when it comes to the major capital projects. And I picked out a couple of departments there: Public Works, NDS, and Parks and Recreation. We have an incredibly aggressive slate of projects and planning initiatives in each of those things. I think we'll be fortunate to meet the schedule that we've laid out here. We're going to try as hard as we can to do so, but we're certainly at capacity in those areas, and we'll need to have that conversation as you have your budget deliberations. Last slide, I promise. Okay. My final thoughts. You should be very happy with where we're at financially. I think we're in a great financial position, and we've been able to address some really pressing issues in our community over the last several years. We've just talked for an hour and a half, and I haven't even mentioned flood recovery. You know, but we're 10 years post-flood, and we're wrapping up the Gateway project next year. That's a heck of an accomplishment for our community, and we should be proud of that. Proud of the funding, outside funding that we brought in, and the local funding that we raised to carry out those projects. What I really appreciate about our staff is, you know, our staff is not afraid to tackle the big, tough projects. It's easy to kind of kick the can down the road on some tough projects like a Washington Street or a First Avenue grade separation project or coming up the Pedmouth. Those are difficult projects, really trying not only on the staff side but the community side, but we're able to aggressively pursue those, and that's important. We've been able to dedicate funds to affordable housing for the first time in the last few years. I think we're in a great position to do that. I mentioned the Access Center. The last bullet is looking ahead and kind of forecasting where you want to go. You talked a lot about bicycle-friendly community. There's more conversation about transit. I think we're really excited, and we have the resources to be able to go after and look at a more integrated transportation network for our future. We have some instability in our tax base. That's that cloud of the property tax reform. So that's going to continue to challenge that core service delivery going forward. And what I really urge the council, my final thought to you is, as you begin your budget deliberations and later this month as you begin your strategic plan initiatives, use this financial position wisely. You have opportunities. You're in a position to pursue opportunities that you can collectively agree to and you think will impact the community the most. But there's got to be that focus there. And that's one thing I'm going to stress as we get into strategic planning. I think we really need to think about, do we want to do 30 or 40 smaller things? And that's not a bad strategy. Or do we really want to try to focus in and narrow that list of areas and say, you know what, we can do these handful of things really, really well and have a profound impact on the community. You know, something like that transit study and that focus. In order to accomplish that and do so in the right way, we really need to have that organizational focus to keep us locked in. So. I'll remind you of that, at least my perspective, as you have your deliberations here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for everybody out here that sat through that. Hopefully, we didn't put you to sleep. There's plenty of caffeinated coffee back there if we did. And now the rest of the discussion is at the council table.
Before we get into questions from the council, I want to thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Simon, for making such a great presentation about the context that we are acting in and the choices that are possibly available, our expenditures, our revenues, et cetera, and how we need to act with regard to developing our budget for the forthcoming year. And I also want to thank people in the audience and people at home who might have been watching this. And I really invite you to submit any written comments or phone comments to us about your concerns, about your suggestions, and any other kind of response you have with regard to the overview we've just seen. And I mean that for people watching on TV as well. So there are ways to do it, right? You can phone us, you can send us emails, you can use your other social media, you can contact city staff. There are a whole range of ways to do it. And with that, I think we need to give our council a chance to ask any questions they feel a need to ask at this point with regard to the overview we've just seen.
Jeff, I'm curious about the retail consultant. What would you envision that would do, and what are we looking at in terms of particular budget outlay for that position?
So that'll be in the economic development budget. This is something we've never done, but a lot of cities have, and I've had a couple of council members over the years talk to me about being a little bit more aggressive on the retail side of things. So it's a $50,000 expenditure that we would anticipate. We'd have to do an RFP, but it would be someone from the outside to come in and analyze our retail community, give us suggestions on maybe areas where our types of retail would normally fit in a market like this, but that are absent, and then really give that information and some of the connections that that consultant would have to the commercial brokers, to the commercial property owners. It's not really the city. We don't have retail space that we would be looking to fill. It's more supplementing the resources that property owners and commercial real estate brokers would have. It's not a focus on downtown. I mean, that would be encompassed in it. Most of the concerns that I've heard is, what's the retail like on the highway corridor or on some of the, the western side of the community, and how can we supplement what we have there? So there's consultants out there that help with that, and again, a number of cities do. We just looked at a few. Dubuque recently did that and have had some success with that. You're typically looking at, more on the national level, the chains and that sort of thing. It's information, it's connections, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Rocky, to your point, this is something that I've talked to Jeff about before. I think, Susan, you've been in some of those conversations as well. I actually think it's in the wrong section from a strong local economy standpoint. I mean, I know that it obviously promotes that, but to me, it's really a social justice issue. I don't know how many people have come to me and specifically talked about the fact that it's tough to get, clothes and other things based on where they're living. And so when we're talking about walkability and some of the other things that I know our council is promoting, which is important, we really need to provide a different retail market for a lot of our residents that aren't able to, I can shoot down the highway real quick and go to Corbridge Mall if I need to get something from that retail standpoint. But a lot of our residents can, and this is another, concern that came out not only in the campaign, but again, just conversations in general with the, change in Kmart and the fact that Kmart's going down. I have some serious concerns about what's going to happen to our southeast side as far as people being able to walk and, frequent that establishment. So, again, that would be my only comment to that I think it's a social justice issue. But, it's fine
Sure.
where it's at.
My only...
You can do it.
This may not work today. My response to that, Kingsley, would be, I think there's a lot of things that we do that are and should be social justice related, but I don't think that means we put them under a social justice category. I think we keep them under the logical categories, and that is definitely an economic development issue. But I think it comes with that focus that we've talked about, is thinking about all these issues from a social justice perspective. And I've had those same concerns and those same conversations with Jeff, particularly about the southeast side and with Kmart closing.
This may be an unrelated question. along the same lines, but the other issue that I've heard concern about is affordable retail. You know, businesses looking for affordable retail and not being able to find it. I'm not hearing or sensing that this will be addressing that aspect of our retail sector, but it is a concern.
You mean affordable retail space?
Yeah, for businesses.
Yeah, and I think that's, at least when I've heard that concern, you're really focused on the downtown, urban core. No, this type of consultant would not necessarily be brought on to address that. This is more filling existing spaces, working with, again, the property owners and the brokers.
Anything else? All right, so we're going to dive much more deeply into each of these items by going through each of the departments. But I'm looking at the schedule and looking at the time. I know we're running behind schedule, but I think we need to take that short break.
Yeah.